Awesome. Okay. I'd like to get started. I have put the link for the raffle in the chat for today. And my name is Eric Smith. I'm going to talk about my Datatable Flow Screen component. First, I want to thank all of the sponsors. It's great to be back at Pakistan Dreaming. You guys put on an excellent event. You've got some great speakers, and I look forward to being part of that again this year. Again, my name is Eric Smith. I work as a technical architect for Rafter One, formerly known as Gear CRM. I'm a Salesforce MVP. I have 6 certifications, and I've been working in the technology field for over 45 years and in a number of different roles. And today, I want to talk about why somebody would want to use a data table component. Why did I create the data table component? The reason I created it to begin with, when I first started working with screen flows, one of the standard components and options I used was something called, it was the ability to do a dynamic record choice. And a dynamic record choice allows you to display a list of records and allow the user to select one or more of those. The challenge with that component was that you could only display a single field. And if you see on the screen here, I've got a lot of information, but what that really is that is a single field. I created a formula field that took 4 other fields, kind of matched them all together with some separator characters, and I was using that in my dynamic record choice to display that information on the screen. The challenge here is it's not very readable. Everything gets kind of pushed together. There's no alignment, there's no columns, and I wanted a way to display that information in a better format that was easier for the user to look at and interact with. So that's where the data table component came in. Some of the things that allowed me to do was to give that cleaner display. I could still do single record selection, multiple record selections, and then we could really go beyond dynamic record choice by offering things like inline editing, sorting, filtering, changing column widths, turning text wrapping on and off, and really allowing the user to interact with that table while they're running the flow. So here's an example of choices on a screen in a flow, but rather than using dynamic record choice, I'm using different data tables, and we can see that that information is now formatted in a fashion that's much easier for somebody to interact with and make choices from. Let's just take a look at the differences here. Here I'm comparing dynamic record choice to data tables, and as we can see, we can do checkboxes and select multiple records, or we can set a table up with radio buttons and select individual records. And as the user, I can change the column widths, I can wrap the text, I can turn that on and off, I can sort different fields, I can even go in and do filtering to narrow down my choices. So there's really a lot more the user can do, and it's a lot easier for them to make those selections and interact with that data when you're using a data table. And let me try and go to the next screen here. There we are. So I want to show you what's involved when you're actually going to build a flow and put a data table in it. It's pretty straightforward. I'm going to start by creating a new flow. And in this particular case, I want to create a screen flow. That's where we use the data table component. My personal preference now is to use auto layout. So I'm going to start, the first thing I want to do in my flow is to get the records that I want to display in the data table. This is at a dev org. There's a few accounts out there. So I'm just going to get the accounts, and I'm just going to get all the accounts. I don't need to narrow it down or filter it. There's only a few in here. So we're going to get all of those account records and make them available to the flow. And now I'm going to add a screen. I would just give the screen a name, and on that screen, I want to drag on my data table component. So it's right there on my list of custom components once I have it installed. So like many other components, you just give it an API name. And now I'm going to say, what object do I want to use? I select my account object. And now it says, okay, which records? So I take the result of my get accounts. And now I'm going to configure the data table for what I want it to look like. So I'm going to pick and choose the fields that I want to put in the data table. And here I'm being presented with a list of all of the fields in the account object. So I can pick and choose which ones I want to have in the data table. I'm going to pick 4 different fields here. And you can even change the order in which they appear on the columns. So once I've made that selection, I now see a sample data table, and I can interact with this sample data table to continue to configure it. So it makes it fairly easy to work with this component when you're trying to design or set up what you want that data table to look like in your flow. I can do things like change the label on a column from the default field label to something else. I can even go and search for and select icons that I want to appear as part of the column header. In this case, for the phone number, I want to put a symbol of a phone, so I can find that. There we go, the call icon. So I'm going to add that to my column header. And I can even do alignments. I can align left, I can align center, I can align right. I can drag and drop those column widths to make them be exactly what I want to have them when I display the data table in my flow. And I can even turn on and turn off inline editing and filtering on a column by column basis. Sorry about that, my slides jumped ahead without me. Let's see if I can jump back ahead in this demo here. Sorry about that. Some of the challenges of live presentations. All right, I'm going to try and jump ahead to the next slide. So the column wizard or the configuration of that data table, this is actually another flow that's running as part of this component that you use automatically when you are creating or configuring the data table component. And it allows you to do those adjustments, selections, and other things as you are configuring the component. And this is done through what's called a custom property editor, which is it's actually a Lightning component in itself. The data table is a Lightning component, and then its custom property editor is another Lightning component. If we look at what you see on the screen here on the left-hand side, without a custom property editor, all you can see in any custom component is just a list of all of the attributes in alphabetical order. It's kind of tricky to do that. You're going to really need to have the documentation side by side while you're working on that. Whereas the custom property editor, which we see on the right, gives me as a developer much more control over how I want to present those configuration options to you, the administrator who is building a flow that's going to use this component. Want to make it as powerful yet as easy for you as possible. So that is the built-in wizard flow. And it allowed you to do things like pick the fields, make all the adjustments, and you can even save attributes. Once you've set up a data table, if you want to use other data tables and other flows but have them look the same, you can actually save those configurations and load them in to other flows at a later time. In addition to having the custom property editor, one of the things that this component supports is not only can you display a table of records of any standard Salesforce or custom Salesforce object, you can design your own object, build your own information out, either as an Apex-defined object or just as a string of characters, and use that, pass it into the data table, and use that to display your data in that tabular format. Here's an example here of just a string of data where you can define a field and field values for as many records as you want. Pass that string into the data table component. It'll recognize what you've given it, and it'll display that for you in a formatted manner. Here's an example. This is a utility I wrote a few years ago to show a table or list view of flows and process builders, and then once the user makes a selection, allow them to batch delete inactive versions. And in order to do this, there is no standard object that has flow or process builder information. I was actually pulling information in from 3 different objects, Salesforce objects, to get the information I wanted to display in this table. So I'm displaying flows or process builders along with their status, version numbers, and other things. And this allows me to display the information, allow the user to select various records or inactive versions of these flows, and then just batch delete them. So that's a use case of a data table where we're basically defining our own information. You can do some pretty interesting formatting in the data table. You can change what some of the backgrounds of the cells look like within certain parameters. You can use, you can have links, you can have images. There's a lot of different things that you can put in that data table. You can even do things like, as I mentioned, you could do inline editing of different fields. You could select multiple records, and then later in your flow, you can act upon those edited values, those selected records, and use those for other options in your flow. Some of the requirements for this component, it does include 3 Apex classes, and like any component that uses Apex, you do have to give the individual users who will be running the flow with this particular component, you have to either in their profile or in a permission set, you need to give them access to these 3 Apex classes. There's also, in order to support the custom property editor, I use some base packs that are published on Unofficial SF that these are the individual components that are used within that property editor to allow you to interact with that table and configure the component for use. So those need to be installed as well in order to configure this component. How popular is it? How widely used? I ran a report recently and found that the data table component was installed in over 45,000 different Salesforce orgs. So that tells me that a lot of people have found a lot of very interesting use cases for this component. I love seeing that. Love hearing about some of the, the ways that people put this to use that I may not have thought of. It's just great to see. And I'm going to show you a few use case examples here from some real life customers. Here's an example of a company that wanted the ability to clone it was like a custom version of the opportunity object. But not only did they want to clone this object, they wanted to select child records from 4 different child objects and pick and choose which child records they wanted to be part of that cloned opportunity object. So by using the data table and using the selection capability, this customer was able to display that data, select the child records that they wanted to use, and make that part of the clone process. Here's just a simple use case on a Lightning record page where somebody wanted to display some records. And one of the nice things about the data table is if you are displaying the primary name field for a particular object, you can display that as a hyperlink. And the user, when they're looking at that table, can click on any of those hyperlinks and go directly to that record right from this table that's being displayed. Another way the data table can be used, here's an example again of a data table being on a Lightning record page, but they wanted to control who could see this information and who couldn't. So this flow is actually on everybody's Lightning record page, but the flow itself is running the validation against the user and determining, is this user able to see this table or not? And depending upon how the flow calculates that ability to see the table, it either shows the data table or it hides it. But you can put that flow on everybody's screen, but the flow itself is controlling the access to that data. Here's a little more sophisticated example where somebody is creating and maintaining emergency contact information. And the data table allows them to inline edit and make changes. They can select individual records, click a button, a custom button, to then perform further actions on those records. They can click some toggle buttons, refresh the page, and see different lists of records based on those different filter criteria. Here's another example of, on the top of the screen here, this is just a static table where the client just wanted to see this exact information on their flow screen, but they wanted it in a formatted table. So rather than trying to figure out the HTML and get something to display in a formatted fashion, I'm just using the data table. I'm building out a string of records, and it's always the same. I build out the string of records. I display it as a record string in my data table, and then I have my formatted information right here on the screen. So it's not even real records, it's just formatted data. Here's another example which was done where this information, again, this is not individual records from a given object, but what the flow is doing, it's doing roll-up information inside of the flow and creating custom summary records that is calculated when the flow runs, and then those custom records are passed into the data table and shown in this formatted fashion for the user to make selections from. This also has an interesting feature in this particular flow. There's a toggle button that's kind of like a pretend filter in that they can toggle this on and off, but what they're doing is they're using conditional visibility in this flow to either hide or display one of two different data tables that are in the flow. So by toggling that button, they're just changing which table gets displayed. So it's almost like it's doing filtering. That's what the user sees it as. But the person that created the flow is just using conditional visibility to do that. Just some of the restrictions around data table. I've been working on this for about 3 or 4 years now. There are still a few things that it cannot do. Certain data types are not supported for inline editing. And there are just a few of those listed here: time fields, encrypted fields, lookup fields, and a few other ones. If you are using a screen reader for somebody who is visually impaired, the data table has to have a header. You don't have to display it, but you have to define a header or at the top of the table for the screen reader to find it on the page and allow somebody to interact with the data table through the adaptive capabilities of Salesforce. Those lookup links, those hyperlinks I mentioned earlier, the user has to have edit access to the object whose records you're displaying in order for those links to work. And if it's a master detail field, there's a checkbox when you configure those that says reparentable, and that has to be checked in order for those links to show. And there's a few things that aren't supported. If you have an object, and this is due to a Salesforce bug, nothing to do with the data table, but geolocation fields in a record do cause issues, so you need to leave those out when you're doing a get records to pass into a data table. If you're using the content version object, the version data field, which is actually a big blob of the actual file itself, that'll basically overload the Lightning component, the Apex that's running. Is just too much information. You would never display that anyway, so I just recommend that you leave that field out. And then one of the standard objects that Salesforce has, the location object, does not work directly. Although you can get around that and put it in as a record string and display it that way. But the actual location object itself, you can't pass it in directly. And that's really because Salesforce standard objects, they're not all very standard. They can have some very unique features with them. So that's what we've got on that. And there's a lot of documentation and information available for this component. There's some links here. We'll make the slide deck available to you. And there's the website itself has complete details, information, installation instructions, links to other articles on some of the special things that you can do with the data table component. So that is, in a quick nutshell, why I created it, some of the things you can do with it, some real life examples. So I want to thank you very much You can reach out to me at any time with any questions or information, feedback on the component itself. So again, thank you very much. And as promised, we have a raffle, and I'm going to put that on the screen, and we'll share that with you as well.